Whether you call it kveik, kvik, or kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. The country of Belgium is known for many things: palm frites, delicious chocolate, fluffy waffles, and perhaps most importantly, beer. Indeed, Belgium has a rather strong beer culture that's arguably anchored by Trappist styles, which were originally brewed by monks and tend to have that recognizable Belgian character. For quite some time now, Trappist monks have kept things simple by brewing just a handful of traditional styles. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and with me on this episode to discuss the style known as Belgian Dubbel is contributor Cade Jobe.
Oh man, here I was all ready to talk about Belgian Dubbel or Dubbel, and you said palm frites, and now that's all I'm thinking about.
Oh, buddy!
But I love those. But I do also love Belgian Dubbel or Dubbel, the beer. It's one of my. I really love that style. I brew it every year, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun and fantastic to talk about. I think we're going to have some good information in this episode too. So
yeah, I've never been one to love beers that have really strong fermentation character. For whatever reason, I just tend to prefer cleaner styles. I know that's subjective. However, there's just something special about a well-made Belgian Dubbel. I've had excellent examples from Belgium, as well as American craft breweries and even home brewers. In fact, a close friend of mine here in Fresno, Sean Wood, who you may remember from our episode where we talked about House of Pendragon's sour program. He makes banging Belgian Dubbel, multiple Belgian beers, including Dubbel. I look forward to chatting about this historical style, as well as my attempt to brew one using short and shoddy methods. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up in December is one of my favorite people from Yakima, Washington, a guy who brews hazy IPA that I actually enjoy. Nathan Cooper from Wandering Hop Brewery. You've heard him on the show before when we've been up there for Hop Harvest, and now he's going to sit down for an hour with patrons and answer their questions. Trust me, you do not want to miss this session, especially if you're into New England IPA. We've already had a ton of great guests like John Palmer, Michael Tonsmeyer, Dr. Tom Shellhammer, and many, many more. And all past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. If you'd like to be a part of these sessions, all you need to do is head to patreon.com/Brewlosophy and pledge $3 or more per month. That's it. You get killer rewards and we get to keep making this show for you to listen to. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the gorgeous BH15 single-tier system, which comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Neil Shergan, a professional brewer in Israel, wrote in with some deep thoughts on our recent Brews Views episode where we talked about using adjuncts. Neil said, "One of our considerations in crafting beers is the use of local ingredients. I live in Israel, in the desert, basically, and there's very little that's around me that I can resource from the traditional ingredients other than water or perhaps using a local yeast. This is not hop country, and although grains are certainly grown commercially, not the varieties used in beer, and there isn't a malt house in Israel. As to local adjuncts, one example I enjoyed was a sage beer made by some guys brewing in their mother's attic. They had a few commercial releases that I believe were contract brewed, and I enjoyed them. The sage replaced the hops, but was still rather subtle. Another example is a beer that is made with, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, with a hyssop addition The word in Israel for the spice mixture is zatar, which I believe is Arabic, but describes a mixture of spices, mostly hyssop, but also sesame and probably salt and other spices. I'm told the beer is very good and pairs well with hummus. This would be something familiar to Israelis and Middle Easterners. Finally, I think one of the issues you missed was using adjuncts to add to the nutritional value of beer. We tend to forget that beer is food. When crafting a beer, I'm also thinking of nutrition, calories, and possibly enriching the positive aspects too. We can boost antioxidant levels with the use of certain organic foods and even add elements associated with reducing bad cholesterol. So I think it's important to consider the idea of nutrition. I mean, we are already drinking it. Let's make it healthy too. A lot to unpack there, Cade.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I would start probably with that last piece about nutrition. That's really fascinating. That's actually something that I don't consider at all. Whenever I'm crafting brewing recipes, it's not something that I've considered before, but that's actually something I'd like to start doing. So yeah, I mean, that sounds that to me sounds pretty interesting. He didn't specify the ingredients and stuff that he's talking about. Maybe you could send me an email if he's listening to this podcast. I'd love to hear more about that. But that may be something I do a little bit of research into. That's pretty cool to think about crafting recipes also with nutrition.
That is certainly not something that I consider when making beer. It's funny that he kind of has this perspective that beer is food. And it sounds like that really influences the way he thinks about the recipes that he's making. I get that it's food. It's there is a nutritional value to it, but that is so not on the top of my list of things that I'm thinking about when I'm designing a recipe. Probably won't be. I do, however, think it's very interesting to consider the fact that there are people all over the world who don't have the luxury of access to the standard brewing ingredients. I mean, no malt house in Israel and no hop fields in Israel, and yet trying to craft fresh tasting beer, you kind of have to resort to using what's local, I would imagine. And a sage beer, that sounds weird to me, but maybe it would be really good. I had a friend in town here a couple years ago bring over a pale ale that he brewed with I think it's called Verbana from his front yard, and man, I'm telling you, it was really good. It imparted this really surprisingly nice, pungent, kind of herbal, lemony character to this pale ale that he had, to the point where I could see maybe swapping out even some hops for using that. I mean, hey, if you can get away with tossing zatar or hyssop or, any other, whatever you have available to you into a beer and it tastes good, then that's what you got to do, right? If you can't get your hands on the fresh hops like we can, I can see how that's going to motivate a different approach to making beer. I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I like using spices in beer. I mean, I've done I think I've done an experiment on using a spice tincture before. I like using spices, and I have used sage in some of those, I call them like Thanksgiving beers. They're like the brown ales or like the late Oktoberfest, like the little darker Oktoberfest beers that start coming out around November. I certainly think that those could benefit from a little bit of sage. I think that's really good, and I love zatar on food. It's a really, really good spice that I like to use. That might be pretty. I don't know how I could put it into a beer. That's something I'd have to think about a little bit more. But I think that's absolutely true. And I mean, if you look at history of the adjunct lager, right? I mean, there's a reason why we call that an adjunct lager, and why it was originally brewed, because 2-row didn't grow very well here in America, so they had to have the 6-row version, and then add adjuncts to it to get it where they wanted it to be for sale, or where customers wanted it to be, I guess is a better example. But yeah, I know y'all talked about that a little bit, but really, really fascinating feedback. So much to unpack there, and almost a whole nother episode to talk about there. Yeah.
Neil, if you're up for it, reach out and let us know how you're brewing with these different spices and herbs, I would imagine, that are available to you. And I'd love to try one of those beers, man. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of hummus, so anything that complements hummus, this sounds good to me. But
totally, me too.
Thank you for the feedback, Neil. We really do appreciate you writing in from Israel. And again, I'd love to try the beers that you're making with all that crazy stuff. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Well, for the first time since we started this whole shindig, we're all out of beer reviews. For what I'm assuming is a minority of our listeners, this is likely welcome news, but I know most of you share my sentiment of being bummed out by this. Not to worry, I've currently got a fridge full of listener-submitted beers, and I'm telling you, it is a full fridge. My wife will attest to that, and I'm hoping to be able to serve these to Jersey and Tim sooner than later. Of course, with the holidays coming up and all of the quarantining that's going on, it may be very difficult to do that. I do want to thank everyone who has submitted beers. I really apologize for the delay, and even in a worst-case scenario, we'll make sure that you get the credit on the show at some point, even if that means we do an episode that's just dedicated to reviewing all of those beers that are in my fridge. Again, thank you for sending them in. If you do want to have your beer reviewed on the show, whether that's by Jersey and Tim or whatever else we come up with, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. When we return from this break, the focus will be on Belgian Dubbel. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. I've been involved in brewing long enough to remember when Belgian styles were all the rage. I mean, there was a time where it seemed homebrewers in particular were making more Belgian beer than IPA, though the situation we're in nowadays is quite different. Regardless, one of my favorite Belgian styles is Dubbel, which before we jump into its history, which is very interesting, I just want to say that I am pronouncing it correctly. And I heard you say it earlier, Cade, at least according to a guy from Belgium who I was hanging out with a couple of years ago, and I was calling it Dubbel, and he kind of gave me that face of, why are you saying it that way? And explained to me that in Belgium, it is pronounced Dubbel. Now, I know that we went through this whole thing with the Kveik thing. Maybe it's still wrong, but I have adopted Dubbel because I do believe that that is the regionally accurate way of pronouncing this delicious style.
Man, I may have to change the way I pronounce it too. I think I've always referred to it as Dubbel, and that's always how I've heard it pronounced. Of course, by Americans. I mean, I've never actually spoken to a person from Belgium who was where we were talking about Dubbel, or it came up. But hey, I mean, if that's what your buddy says, then I'll try my best on this episode to stick with Dubbel instead of Dubbel, even though that feels weird to me.
Yeah, well, and what's funny is his comment to me was he had mentioned, you Americans, I think, try to make everything sound so fancy. He said the way we pronounce it is exactly how it's spelled. So if you just say double, and I believe actually triple, which is another Belgian Trappist style, is pronounced triple, not tripel. So we just got to. Sometimes the easier way is the way that you go, and so we're just going to accept that it's called double for this episode. Let's talk a little bit about the history of this really quite old style.
Yeah, I mean, the history of this is one of those things that's really cool. And one of my favorite things about Belgian beers is they don't really fit into style guidelines all that well. I mean, we've got a style called Belgian Dubbel, and there's a lot of research and work that's gone into sort of defining it as a style. And I think it's one of the more identifiable Belgian beers, like Saison, Dubbel, Triple. You can people have heard about those and they've tried them and tasted them, and there's generally an acceptance on here. But one of the reasons why it's so hard to define is because it's been brewed for a long time. I mean, if you look back in the Middle Ages, almost every brewer was brewing some sort of sweet brown ale, right? It may not have been particularly what we would define today as a Dubbel. It might not even have had hops in it at all. It might have just had some spice blend or Groot or something like that. But it's been brewed for a long time. The history's kind of all over the place in this, and I don't know that there's a very specific, accepted reason for why we call it Dubbel or how Dubbel came to be.
Well, we call it double, Cade. That's the thing, is it?
Sorry.
I'm going to do it, man. I got to do it.
That's fine. Do it. This is, I'm going to break that habit. We'll see. It's funny, real quick on the side on that. I do say triple. I've never said tripel. I say Dubbel and triple, which doesn't really
whatever
seem to
floats
make
your
sense,
boat. We know what you're talking about. I'll not be that annoying. Okay.
No, that's fine. But the style, this double style, at least most people accept that it really started to become popular in the 1800s. And there's really a couple of cool theories about how double came to be, or how double got its name. The one that's sort of, most simplest and probably most accepted is that these barrels of beer that were being brewed would just have an X, two X's, or three X's on it, and that would refer to the strength of the beer. So X is single, 2 is double, and 3 is triple. So in Belgium, whenever they were brewing these things, they would just refer to it that way. But I think there's sort of a more interesting theory to me, which kind of makes more sense. If we're just talking about the relative strength of those three beers, single, double, and triple. See, I got it right that time. Double.
Yeah, you're working hard, Cade.
I'm working. Rather than just referring to the strength of the beer, because they are different, a double is very different than a triple, different alcohol content, but also different color, different flavors, different aromas, different ingredients. It's a really different beer in the scheme of things. This theory, which I think is really cool, had to do with party guiling. And so in the early 1800s, brewers were taxed on the size of their mash tuns. All right. And so you put grain into the mash tun, and then you got taxed on however much grain you put into the mash tun and the size of the mash tun, the volume of the mash tun. So what brewers were doing is packing as much grain as they could into these small mash tuns, which ended up creating something called a turbid mash, which is not the focus of this episode. But what they would have to do is they could run 3 beers off of the same grains. Right. So you had this super dense mash tun. You run the first runnings off of it, and you'd have something like, 22-25% fermentable sugars that you'd get off of those first runnings. Then you do another mash, drain that off, and you'd get around 15%, and then do another mash, and you'd get around 7.5% of fermentable sugars. So if you look at it, you've got 3 different strengths of beer there. So you've got one that's around 7.5, one that's around 15, and then one that's between 22 and 25. It kind of makes sense to call them single, 7.5, double, 15, and then the triple, which not being quite, 3 times, but pretty close, 7.5 to 22.5, which I think is really cool. And that kind of explains maybe why these beers got that different name, because they were first runnings beer, which was probably just going to be a table beer for the monks that were brewing it. The second runnings beer, which was going to have not as high alcohol content and maybe need some other flavors, enhancements to it, like, for example, candy sugar, which we'll get into in a little bit. And then you had the first match, which had the highest sugar content and had the most malt flavors from it. And so that made the triple. So that one to me seems like a really apt explanation for how Dubbel got its name. Double.
Well, and just to clarify, I think you mixed it up. So the first runnings would have been the triple, second runnings would have been double, and then the third runnings would have been your ankle or your single, right? Because that's going to have the lower OG. That third runnings batch is going to be the table beer. Now, the interesting thing about, I really want to talk about the breakdown between what a Trappist brewery is and how Trappist compares to Abbey beers and stuff like that. But what's interesting to me about this naming convention for these beers is, in addition to having different strengths, they also have different colors. So if you think about one of the rules of thumb, kind of a heuristic that a buddy of mine told me, and it's so simple, but until he told me, I never thought of it this way. A single will always be pale, as will a triple. So the odd numbers are always pale, and the even numbers are always dark. So double and quad will always be dark. Ankle and triple will always be pale. So that's a nice little rule of thumb for you if you're brewing one of these beers. They also have different OGs as well, so different strengths.
Yeah, that's a cool way of thinking about it too. I never thought of it that way, but that makes sense to me too. The quads, most of the quads that I've seen, although I have seen some pale quads in the United States. I've never been to Belgium, so I haven't tried any of these beers actually in Belgium. But plenty of Abbey style beers here in the United States.
Yeah.
I think most quads that I see are dark, but I have seen some lighter ones. But that's cool. So 1 and 3 light beers, 2 and 4 dark. Cool. Very cool.
Now let's talk. You mentioned Abbey beers, and there is a distinction between a Trappist beer and an Abbey beer, a Trappist brewery and Abbey ale. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Trappist is a designation for those beers that are made by actual Trappist monks, whereas Abbey beers are similar styles that are produced in secular breweries or on like a monastic estate or something, but maybe not brewed by actual Trappist monks. So that's a designation for a relatively small number of breweries in the world.
Yeah. Trappist is a protected appellation, and it's protected. It's supposed to be protected internationally, although I see a couple of places here in in the United States calling their styles Trappist. But yeah, Trappist is a group of Christian monks that have been brewing beer for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Brewing beers in those abbeys, and it's kind of interesting that the Westmalle certainly is a Trappist abbey and a brewery, and it gets a lot of credit for the impact that it's had on those Trappist style ales, being the Dubbel triple mainly, but interestingly, Chimay, I think that's how you say it. Maybe it's Chimay. I don't really know.
I think it's Chimay, dude. I think you're good on that one.
Chimay. So Chimay in the 1960s sued and said there were a bunch of Belgian breweries that were calling their beers Trappist. And Chimay said, hey, you can't call your beer Trappist if you're not in fact Trappist,
Yeah.
And so we're doing it according to these styles and these traditions that we've been doing for, a long time. And with some tweaks over time, but we've been doing it for a long time. We need to protect this. And the European court system at the time said, yeah, actually, we are going to protect that. So yeah, Trappist means something specific. It means that it was specifically brewed at those breweries, or at least contracted by the Trappist monks.
Right.
So that's pretty cool, and I think it's something that really defines those styles of the Trappist single, the Dubbel, and the triple. But the Abbey beers, that's how everybody's sort of getting around the Trappist appellation. So calling a beer Abbey style or an Abbey Dubbel or an Abbey triple. Abbey is not a protected appellation because it doesn't refer to that specific group of monks, and so that's why you'll see that really often here in the United States. Oh, this is our Abbey style double or our Abbey style triple.
And the thing is if you can go and get, for the most part, you can get Trappist beers, Trappist double here in the States, depending on how good your local beer store is, I suppose. But there are probably some of the most popular ones out there. Obviously, Westvleteren 8 is Westvleteren's version of a double. I've had the opportunity to have that one. Good luck trying to get your hands on it at this point, but it's delicious. Chimay Blue is probably one of the most popular and easy to get, Trappist doubles out there. I believe Orval, I don't know if they call that one a double, but it is, Orval is another one of those Trappist beers. Rockefeller's another one. Get your hands on these because those are going to be the more traditional Belgian examples that you can get. But then, of course, you've got breweries here in the States that are making these doubles as well, and I feel like they're doing a good job. A lot of them, especially, you've got Lost Abbey down in San Diego, which is I believe connected to Port Brewing, but they're doing great things on that Belgian front as well. Get your hands on some to try it if you're looking for really traditional examples. You're going to want to go with the stuff made by the Trappist breweries out of Belgium, but you can get some good stuff here in the States as well. Of course, if you're a home brewer, you can make them on your own as well. Now, let's spend some time talking a little bit about how a double is crafted. You talked about the historical approach to making these styles, and I know that there's a little bit of conjecture in there and some storytelling that we've heard and read about. But if you think about if it's true that they are doing this kind of this one big mash and pulling off three different runnings, then you're going to have a wort that is effectively, well, not same, but very similar in color. And we know, like we were talking about, that double is not a pale colored beer. And so how, what types of malt are these breweries using to produce these characteristics, as well as whatever else they're adding to make that beer with a double that we expect it to be?
Well, yeah, that's kind of the defining characteristic in my mind of a double. If we're talking about Trappist or Abbey style beers, there's really, to me, there's like three overarching requirements that you have. And one is it's a high attenuation, so it's super dry beer. It's got high carbonation, really spritzy, has a really nice foam, and then it's got a really strong, interesting yeast character.
Right.
Like that Belgian character, cloves and phenols, and we'll get into those in a little bit. But all three of those beers, though, the single, double, and triple, can all have those, and there's a wide range of malts and colors and flavors that you can get within those three things. So how does the double stand out? And really, one of the main ways that a double will stand out, in my mind, is the use of candy sugar, dark candy sugar. So that's an invert sugar that they've made as part of the candy making process. It's kind of a leftover, is my understanding. It's really dark. It can taste like burnt sugar or raisins or prunes or any of those dark fruits. So that gets added, and it's nearly it's very, very highly fermentable. So it still gets you that nice high attenuation that you're looking for. And it adds a really, really complex flavor to beers. And this is actually just sort of a list for the future. This is actually one of those experiments that I really want to try to do at some point in the future, which is using candy sugar, homemade sugar, or candy sugar versus dextrose, and see what the flavor contribution is. But
yeah. Well, so I'm reading over the BJCP overall impressions here on Belgian Dubbel. It says a deep reddish copper, moderately strong, malty, complex Trappist ale with rich malty flavors, dark or dried fruit esters, and light alcohol blended together in a malty presentation that still finishes fairly dry. You hit on a lot of that stuff, and it, you think about what a Belgian beer in general, what you expect from a Belgian beer, and to me, that is a little bit more assertive ester profile. So those, and for me in a double, that's going to be when combined with that sugary, that darker candy syrup flavor or aroma. Really, you kind of get this dark fruit, kind of pruny, which sounds weird, but is actually quite pleasant. And then I also expect a little bit of that fermentation, that phenolic fermentation character. So some spice in the background. When you put all of that together, the best double that I've ever had whether it's commercial or I'm telling you, my friend Sean makes a mean double, has this presentation, the gestalt of the beer from aroma and flavor and the mouthfeel is just this really warm, almost holiday season kind of experience that you can drink anytime you want during the year. But that's really the impression that I get. It is just a really nice, complex, but not overly annoying or in your face. There's nothing about it that is too pungent, I guess. And the reason I say that is because I feel like, and I mentioned this in a previous episode, I believe that here in America, I feel like sometimes when we're looking at European beers or beers that originated from a different region, we take the parts that are different and then we caricaturize them in our versions of that beer. And thanks to Sean and Aaron, my friends locally here who went on a trip to Belgium a while back, they came back saying, whoa, I don't know if we're doing this right. Those fermentation characteristics are supposed to blend in with the other characteristics of that beer, not be the presenting, the steal the show basically. And that's why I say, when Sean makes one of these Belgian beers now, they are so much different than so many of the examples of Belgian styles, including double that I've had here in the States. They're so balanced and subtle. Yes, that fermentation character is there. And I do believe that it is sort of a defining characteristic, but it doesn't overshadow all of the other interesting stuff. And one of the unique characteristics to Belgian Dubbel is the use of a dark candy sugar. In fact, I think a lot of people, that is their sole source of color and additional flavor on top of the Pilsner malt that's used to make these beers.
Yeah, totally. A lot of people do that. And that even sort of lends some evidence about what we were talking earlier about how it got its name as the Dubbel. If you think about if you're running off these runnings that are the same color and flavor as your first runnings and your third runnings, a way that you can differentiate this second kind of mid-range beer, mid-alcohol level beer, is by adding like this candy sugar to it and giving it this dark color and this raisiny, pruny dark fruit character. And I love that you said that. The way that you described Belgian beers as having all of these accents, having all of these really unique details and subtle touches to them. That's one of my favorite ways to think about Belgian beers just in general. But specifically the Trappist and the Abbey styles, the Dubbel, triple, and quads that I've had. I've never had a single before, but my understanding is they have those as well. Because you have this sort of symphony where you've got this, the candy sugar that adds sort of this sometimes burnt sugary flavor to it. Never acrid, never that horrible overcooked sugar, but it's right. That nice caramely sweetness, that pairs with the raisiny and the prune, and then you get this light accent of clove or something perfumey from the yeast, and then the bitterness comes through. Nothing overly hoppy about it, but the bitterness comes through, and it really accentuates this beer. And then it just finishes so dry. It's just this nice, really refreshing beer.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite things to do with Belgian beers is to pair them with food. I think if you talk about Belgian beer and you don't talk about food, you're doing something wrong, because Belgian beer is just made to be paired with food. I mean, if you think about one of my favorite pairings for a Dubbel, and I'm probably going to get flack about this because everybody's going to go, "What the hell?" But is a really nice, juicy, well-seasoned cheeseburger with put some Swiss and some mushrooms on there and pair that with that Dubbel. I love it because it's got this like nice richness of the meat in the cheeseburger, and that just bears it goes so well with the richness in the Dubbel, those dark fruits and prunes, and then that slightly clovey phenolic.
You are making my stomach growl, Cade. It is lunchtime, and you're making me hungry.
Hey, maybe we can find some pommes frites.
Oh my god,
I
know.
Go get some pommes frites, right?
Or even Belgian chocolate. I mean, you think about all of the foods that Belgium is known for, and I don't think it was an accident that these beers that Belgium is known for, happen to go so well with a lot of the foods that they're known for. It's a delicious style, and one of my favorite aspects of double, and you mentioned it already, is how dry it is. If you're making a double that's finishing higher than about 10-15 or so, then I mean that's pretty high. I expect most of my double to finish below 10-10. That's when I'm making it, and I don't make it often. But that is where I'm at in my FG aim. Now, the BJCP does say that it can finish anywhere between 1008 and 1018 with a starting gravity of 1062 to 1075. So you're gonna, this is a fairly strong beer. ABV of 7 to 7.6 is what the BJCP says. But yeah, that is one of the things that I think contributes to that drinkability. It's one of those unique versions of a beer that's both complex but immensely crushable.
And one of my favorite things too is it looks great. Like pouring a Dubbel into a glass, or a double. Sorry, I said it again.
All good.
But pouring a double into a glass looks so good. I love seeing the different glasswares that the breweries in Belgium use. I think that's just such an underrated addition to a beer, is having the perfect glass created for the beer that you're pouring. And I love seeing, like, especially Chimay's big chalice. I love seeing that chalice, just pour that beer directly into the middle of that chalice. You get like a big 2-inch head of foam on it. It's so aromatic, so luscious. And I just think it's really cool to look at too. It makes you hungry. It makes you want to drink it. And I think especially that like dark amber, reddish copper color. I love to see red highlights in those Dubbels, and I just think it just looks really good too.
Yeah.
To make it a really interesting, tasty beer as well.
So let's talk a little bit about how the ingredients. We've spent some time talking about how simple the malt bill is. Now there are other malts that are known to be used in Belgian styles, including Dubbel. I have a kind of this warm place in my heart for using a dose of Munich malt, because I think it adds that kind of an element of richness, of bready richness. I don't think that's all too traditional, but I do see Munich malt used in quite a few Belgian Dubbel recipes that are floating around online. Perhaps more curious, though, is this specialty grain that we refer to as Special B. And it is known for being used in Belgian beer specifically. In fact, I've been told by some people who tend to be a little bit more hard-headed about things that you don't use Special B in anything other than Belgian-style beers. It is a very pungent grain that contributes, in my experience, a noticeable sweet raisiny character to beer, even when used in relatively small amounts. It's one way to get some of that reddish color that you expect in a Belgian Dubbel. But then there are those who will argue you don't even need to use that in a Dubbel, that you can just use the darker candy syrups to contribute that flavor and that color. What are your thoughts on the use of Special B in Dubbel?
So we talked about accents, right? Accenting Belgian beers. And I think so. I think Special B is absolutely something that you can pair with the candy sugar to give it a really unique accent. So my recipe includes a little bit of Munich, like you said, and also some Special B along with the candy syrup. And then it does have a little, mouthfeel. I usually use Cara Munich, but any, Cara foam or any of that stuff would be fine. For a little bit of mouthfeel, because I like to contribute a little bit of body to it. But that Special B, like you said, you hit all of the reasons why I add Special B. It tastes like raisins, which is great for that dark Dubbel profile. And it just meshes so well with that candy sugar and gives you those little red highlight tints.
Yeah.
So I love using Special B in a Dubbel. I was actually trying to think. I don't know that I've used Special B in anything else, just as part of brewing. But if it's in a dark beer that could stand it, maybe like a porter would be nice with a little bit of Special B in it.
Yeah.
Or something that would use a little bit of raisiny or fruity character. Or hey, here's an idea. Any beer that you're adding that's dark that you're adding some fruits to might benefit from having a little bit of Special B. But yeah, that raisin character is just, to me, that's Special B, and I can smell it. Like I can talk about it right now, and I know exactly what that smell is from Special B.
I'm in the same boat. It's just talking about Special B, I can smell it. I think about 2 pounds like 3 years ago, and I think I honestly still have 1 3/4 pounds left. That's how little you need to impart the characteristic you get from it to beer. It is one of the most talked about. Well, when people talk about Special B, they talk about just how pungent it is. So, a steady hand. You could get away with, again, doing 100% Belgian Pils malt, or any Pilsner malt for that matter, but Belgian Pils is traditional. It's a fantastic malt. You can get away with doing 100% Pils malt and then just using your dark candy syrup to get that color and that flavor. But if you want to add a little bit more layered complexity, consider something like, a punch of Munich malt, a little sprinkle of Special B, maybe some Cara Munich. And again, you're going to create this thing that's your own. Now, traditionally, the hops that were used in Belgian styles, I do believe were generally, what we would refer to as German noble styles, or maybe, I think Czech Saaz was pretty popular, popularly used in these Belgian beers.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the old noble hops, the good German hops, that we're talking about, Tettnang and Sazer. I think Sazer is probably the most common in terms of this, but really what we're looking for here in hops, we're not looking for the hops to add a lot of flavor.
Right.
So we're not looking for fruit characters out of the hops or any of those sort of normal or like American style varieties, like Citra and that kind of stuff that's got those really poppy, fruity, citrusy kind of flavors. You're really just looking for bitterness here.
Yeah.
You're trying to cut that sweetness, that candy sugar, that Pils malt, the special B, the raisins, the prunes. You're trying to cut that a little bit. So one of the things that I've seen, I have never done this, although I would like to try it at some point, is apparently a lot of Belgian brewers, or at least used to, use old hops. So hops that had been sitting or had been stored out for a while that didn't have those aromatic and flavorful characters that the brewers needed, but would add bitterness. So a lot of old hops still contain that bitterness, but don't add those flavor and aroma compounds, or at least this is what I've been told. Maybe worth doing an experiment if we haven't done one already. But that may be a good use for those old hops, is in a style like this. Just put an ounce in it at 60 minutes and get some bitterness from them.
Yeah, when I think about a good, well-made Belgian double, obviously we're going to talk about yeast here in a minute. Again, a feature ingredient in this style, but I do feel like there's an aspect of that hoppy spiciness that can really complement most Belgian styles, particularly Belgian double, because it pairs so well with that sweeter, the perceptibly sweet. I'm not saying that these beers are sweet by any means, but that sugary, dark sugar flavor. So something like a Saaz or perhaps a Hallertau or, a Tettnanger really does meld well with the style. That's not to say, again, that it's going to be a feature that you're going to notice, but perhaps just kind of one of those characteristics that buttresses the entire perceived aspect of this beer. And so that's typically what I stick with. In the past, I've actually made Belgian beers with just a small dose of something like Magnum or Horizon at bittering, and they do come out really well. So that's something you can get away with. I do like to go with the more traditional hopping regimen for when I make these styles. And so on that, what you're looking at doing is adding quite a large charge of a lower alpha, noble hop at the beginning of the boil, perhaps first wort hop as well can work. And so that's kind of my take on it. And I think it works really well. I don't think most modern American hops that are, well, American or even New World hops like Galaxy aren't gonna pair really well with this style. I think you're gonna start getting a little bit of clashing flavors if you go with those really hyper citrusy and tropical fruit varieties. Just my opinion. I've never done it. Now, let's talk a little bit about yeast, because that is such an important component when it comes to making any Belgian style, including double.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would argue that the yeast is the single most important component of making a Belgian beer. I think that's true, but like you said, I think there's a lot of nuance and accents that also define a style. So yeah, yeast is super important, and what we're looking for here is that sort of phenolic and estery character, and also, honestly, a little bit of higher alcohol character as well. I mean, I don't want to taste like medicine or like super alcoholic, or smell it and have that burn whenever I'm drinking these beers, but I do want to smell a little alcohol whenever I'm tasting it, whenever I'm inhaling it, and then inhaling it figuratively by drinking it. So I like I love those phenols, those clove characters, the little spicy, peppery, and slightly perfumey components, and then also the little bit of esters too, just a little bit of fruity ester as well, which I think defines a really good Belgian yeast. And I wouldn't be able to go through this podcast if I didn't give a shout out to the Triple Double. That is my absolute favorite yeast, and I've brewed a lot of doubles over the years. I brew one pretty much at least annually, if not twice a year. And Triple Double is I had that one and I was like, oh my god, this is my favorite version of yeast for those Trappist styles. So
yeah,
but
I've not had the opportunity to use triple double yet, in part because I'm not choosing to make too many Belgian beers, but I have used B45 Gnome, which is another popular Belgian strain that Imperial Yeast puts out, and I've had good experiences with that. I really do want to try a triple double, but yeah, all of the labs are producing Belgian strains, so go and read the characteristics that they list out on them, and then you can kind of pick the one you want to go with. Okay, real quick before we end this segment, I'd like to go through kind of just focusing on the more traditional brewing aspects for making this. Obviously, water chemistry is the first place to start. I'm not entirely sure. I did some poking around if there's a kind of a set water profile or mineral profile that brewers are using when making these beers. I feel like there's room for kind of doing what you want in terms of setting up your mineral profile with the water you're using to brew these beers. My preference, and I say this pretty much about every style, is I tend to like beers that come across as really drinkable and have a slightly sharper perceived flavor component, particularly as it relates to the bitterness, and then washes off my palate. And so because of that, my water profile for almost everything I make favors sulfate to chloride. I'd probably keep the mineral load in total pretty low. So I'd probably go about 50 ppm calcium, and then that would get me with my water, my starting water would get me about 80 ppm sulfate to about 65 or 70 ppm chloride. But again, that's just what I would do if I was planning out my water profile.
Yeah, I probably I rely pretty heavily on Martin Brewingard's spreadsheet and on the Beersmith water profiles. I kind of mix those two whenever I'm doing water chemistry. And in that, there is an Antwerp water profile, although I think it's one of the examples that Martin himself uses as, hey, it may not be a good idea to try to just match the water profile of the city where something is brewed. So I usually generally rely more on that brown balanced profile for a Dubbel. That's just kind of a standard average brown beer. And that one is in both Martin Brewingard spreadsheet and then also in Beersmith as well. And that's just kind of going to get you maybe a little bit more balanced to sulfate than chloride, but pretty close.
Yeah.
That's what I've generally used. But like you, I'm looking for. I want stuff that's going to accentuate the dryness. So if I'm going to lean anywhere, I'm probably going to lean to having a little bit more sulfate than chloride.
Okay.
I want the water chemistry to just be nice and balanced.
Yep. And again, like I really think this is an area where you can kind of tweak the water to fit what it is you're looking for in the double. Now, obviously, being such an old style, brewers back then had to employ certain methods in order to ensure good conversion. And one of those was during the mash. They might utilize a step mash. They might utilize decoctions. I know that there are a lot of people out there who swear that a decoction contributes certain characteristics to beer, positive or desirable characteristics. Based on our experimentation, I don't necessarily buy into that all too strongly just yet, but I won't write it off. I employ a single infusion mash when brewing these beers. I think, depending on what brewery you're talking to, there might be some differences there as well, with some doing step mashes, some doing decoction mashes, and others doing single infusion. Boiling, this is one of the, when you boil a wort, typically we're talking 60 to 90 minutes. And there are people out there, and I know that, there are other styles like Scotch style beers, Scottish style beers, where, you boil them for 15 days or whatever. And I've heard of people, in order to get that kind of caramely richness out of a good Belgian double, will employ like a 2 or 3 hour boil. I'm not sure there's much benefit when you can just add some candy syrup to the wort, but
yeah, I'd always done a 90-minute boil whenever I first, because I think the first recipes I saw for doubles were all 90-minute boils, and I thought that caramelization added a bunch of character to the beer. But like you said, that I think that you're going to get that caramelization character from the candy syrup.
Yeah.
And to me, that just made it so much easier. So I still do 60-minute boils. I generally don't do anything under 60, even though, the Short and Shoddy series is certainly starting to change my opinion on that. But I still do a 60 60-minute boil. I ditched the 90-minute boil, like you said, because I think that I'm getting the same characters from that candy syrup.
So once the wort is boiled, you chill it down like you normally would, and then you ferment it. You pitch your yeast and you ferment it. Now I don't want to spend too much time going into all of the hypotheses that people hold out there about how to get that Belgian character, but there is some talk that Belgian beers tend to be fermented slightly warmer than your typical clean American ale, somewhere up in the 70 degree Fahrenheit to 72, which is like 21 to 22 degrees C range, and that will push these esters out, so you get more of that fermentation profile. Again, in my experience, you kind of want that stuff to be relatively restrained so that it's balanced in the beer. But fermentation temperature is one of those things with Belgian beers and I think it's why a lot of homebrewers were making them in the beginning is that you didn't have to worry too much about stuff like this to make a decent example of a Belgian double.
Yeah, I would say just listen to your yeast manufacturer, to whatever lab you're getting your yeast from. It'll have those fermentation guidelines on there. I've done it both ways. I've fermented warm and I've fermented cooler. I will say I generally like it a little bit warmer, but I've never done an experiment on a Belgian Dubbel back to back of like a warmer ferment versus a cool ferment. I've just done them, successively. I generally like it because I do like that little bit of higher alcohol character that I get as well. I think that just accentuates the dryness, but that's me.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's the thing about Belgian styles is that I feel like there's a lot of room for kind of personal expression. You can do what you want. You can ferment it a little warmer, ferment it a little bit cooler, do what makes the beer that you like. I do think finally when the beer's done fermenting, a very important aspect, if you want to make a classic, more of a classic styled Belgian double, you have to carbonate this thing relatively high. And we're talking, in my experience, I kind of like that 2.7 to 2.9 volumes of CO2 range, where, when you pour it, you are getting a decent amount of foam, but it's worth it because you got this beer that sparkles in the glass and just, to me, that carbonation just really brings out that balanced, fermentation, malt, candy sugar, hop character. And I absolutely love it. In order to do that, you got to make sure you got fairly decently long lines in your kegerator or your keezer, or that you've got some pretty strong bottles. And there's a reason there are bottles from Belgium that people use to carbonate styles like double and saison and such. So make sure that you're minding all that stuff so you don't create bottle bombs. Are you a higher carbonation person when it comes to Belgian double?
Oh, absolutely. I think, like I said earlier, I think that's one of the defining characteristics of Trappist and Abbey ales is that high carbonation.
Yeah.
Now, they're doing it through re-fermentation or bottle conditioning in the bottle.
Right.
But I'm like you. I'm at that 2.7, high 2.7s, maybe even up into the 2.8s for the Dubbels. A triple, I might try to go a little higher.
Oh, yeah.
But that's right where I want to be for a Dubbel. I want it spritzy, and I want a huge head of foam whenever I pour it into the glass. That's just, you get all those aromatics coming out of that foam, and it's an incredible drinking experience for me.
Absolutely. Well, like I alluded to earlier, I'm not the biggest fan of Belgian beers, judging by the fact that I don't brew them very often, but I do really enjoy a well-made double. Wanting something unique on tap, I recently brewed up a batch using short and shoddy methods and served it to unsuspecting tasters for evaluation. More on that when we're back from this break. The brew-in-a-bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew-in-a-bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Last year, after accidentally, inebriatedly, picking up some Belgian candy syrup, I decided that rather than throwing it away, I'd use it to make one of the styles of Belgian ale that I appreciate the most, and that's Dubbel. Of course, I wasn't about to spend a full day making this beer, because who wants to do that? And I ended up cutting quite a few corners on the brew day. Also, just to note, this was only the second batch of Dubbel that I'd ever made. I'd made Dubbel-inspired batches. I'd done, stuff with Special B and candy sugar that was fermented with clean yeast, but this was only the second pointed brew day of mine where I was focusing specifically on Dubbel. Now, for this one, I did rely on a full volume brew in a bag system using the SS Brewtech 1V 240 volt system. So it was your classic brew in a bag full volume. My start time was 1:45 p.m. in the afternoon. I believe it was in the middle of summer or close to summer in June of a couple years ago. And so it was warm outside. I don't know what I was thinking. I wanted to get done quick, I can tell you that. After I collected the full volume of filtered water, I added an unmeasured amount of gypsum and calcium chloride. And when I'm doing that, I'm just basing the amounts on what I've used in the past when I'm actually measuring stuff out. So it's a little bit haphazard, which goes along with the whole short and shoddy approach, but it's been relatively successful for me so far. I then turn the element on to heat up the water before moving on to preparing the grains. Now, I did go with a more complex grain bill because I had a lot of stuff on hand. I did not use Belgian Pilsner malt. Rather, I used 81% Mecca grade Pelton, which is their Pilsner style malt, 6% Metolius Munich style malt. And Cade, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to use Mecca grade yet. Living in Oregon, you're going to have ample opportunity. But Metolius is a very, very unique Munich style malt that contributes a very rich graham cracker-like flavor. That's why I didn't use too much in this one. I wanted to get a little bit of that underneath, that warming kind of graham cracker character underneath the rest of the Dubbel characteristics. And so I went with 6% of that. 5% Special B, which is quite a bit. There are people who will say that's almost too much for any style of beer. But again, to me, it's a Belgian style grain. And I used 3% honey malt, which I only did that because I had some on hand and figured why not. And then later on, I didn't add this to the mash. Of course, I used 5% in total of amber candy syrup. What are you thinking about that grain bill so far?
I love that grain bill. I have not yet had a chance to try Mecca grade malts, but I'm super excited about it. I was at my local homebrew shop a couple of weeks ago before all of the recent closures and stuff. But I was so excited to see Mecca grade on the shelves, and I'm really excited to give it a try. You guys are always talking about it as a really good malt.
Yeah.
That's probably a little more Special B than I would normally put into it. But I think, you used that D80. I usually use the D120, which is quite a bit darker. And I think I'm getting a little bit more raisiny dark fruit characters from mine versus yours. So I think I like your grist that you did there, using a little bit more Special B with that lighter color candy syrup. So
yeah, and just I kind of alluded to it earlier, but again, I was drinking one night and I hopped on more beer, and anybody who's ever done that, which is probably most of you out there, everywhere, you know that you start seeing things and you have these ideas that pop into your head, and then it's the shopping cart of why nots. Oh, why not? I'm just going to toss that in there. And for some reason, I did that with some D80 candy syrup, and when it showed up, I remember scratching my head thinking, what the hell was I thinking I was going to use this for? And so I designed this beer. You're right. My thinking when it came to the higher amount of Special B was to try to get me into that slightly darker red color range. And so I was crossing my fingers on this one. When the water was to strike temperature, the grain was all milled. And I dropped the bag of grains into the water, and I stirred the grains in to incorporate before checking to ensure that I hit my target mash temperature of 150 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 66 degrees C. Again, I chose that mash temperature in part because I really wanted to drive attenuation in this beer. And, the most Belgian strains are fairly attenuative on their own, but I didn't want to have too many long chain dextrins hanging around, not because you can perceive them as sweet, but because I wanted this beer to have that alcohol that we talk about when it comes to a Belgian double, to be in that 6.5 to 7% range. I know some people who, when they're making this style, will mash even lower, as low as 146, which is about 64 C. That's pretty low. But I stuck with 150 degrees Fahrenheit, 66 C on this batch. Now, I did mash for just 25 minutes, which is not very long. And if you're doing that, what I've found in my experience with short and shoddy is that the bigger the grain bill, the less efficiency I get out of these reduced mash steps. So I still went with it 25 minutes. I just calculated for a slightly lower efficiency. And then once that 25 minutes was up, I removed the grain bags and squeezed the hell out of it until I reached my pre-boil volume. And then as the wort was heating up, that's when I added the Belgian candy syrup. I know a lot of people like to wait to the last 5 to 10 minutes of the boil to add their Belgian candy syrup. Cade, I'm curious what you do. In this batch, I added it as soon as, again, I'm just kind of being flippant about it during the brew day. I added the candy syrup as soon as I removed those grain bags and started heating that wort to a boil.
Yeah, I always add the candy syrup at the end of the boil for me. Or really, honestly, what I've started doing is just adding it at the whirlpool after the heat
Sure.
heat is off. So I just don't want it to caramelize on the bottom of my kettle or stick to the bottom of my kettle, burn on the bottom of my kettle.
Yeah.
So yeah, I usually add it to the end. Although I see a lot of people doing this, like especially if you're doing brew in a bag, like you said, just putting it in right whenever you've collected your wort before you even turn the kettle on. That's plenty warm enough to get it nice and mixed in there, so you shouldn't have any scorching. But yeah, I generally wait until the end.
So scorching is one of those issues you hear about whenever you're using any type of sugar, particularly if it's in the form of syrup. And so my thinking on this was, well, this is a short and shoddy batch. I've got this 240 volt or, whatever, 5,000 watt, 5,500 watt element sitting at the bottom of this kettle, and I have it on full blast. So let me add this syrup now. I'm just going to gently stir while I'm adding it, and we'll see if I get any scorched characteristics out of this beer. Typically, if I'm using candy syrup in a beer, which again I've done a handful of times, I'm like you. I'll add it towards the last 5 minutes or even at flame out, get it incorporated, and then move on from there. But I was doing things different for this batch. So the wort was boiled for just 20 minutes, and during that I added 19 grams of Magnum as soon as a boil was reached, and then 28 grams of Hallertauer Mittelfrüh at 15 minutes left in the boil. Now, I went with Mittelfrüh because at the time it was either that or Tettninger. And to me, Mittelfrüh isn't as pungent as Tettninger. It's one of the things I love about Tettninger, but I didn't want that to go into this Belgian double. I felt like it might have, again, detracted from the overall characteristic of the beer by kind of showing off a little bit more of Tettninger's floral characteristics. At least that's what I pick up from it. So that's why I opted for Mittelfrüh. I didn't have any Sots on hand. Mittelfrüh, in my experience, does have kind of favors a little bit more of that spicy, earthy note, which I felt like would meld well with a Belgian double.
Oh yeah. I mean, I like those noble hop characters for the double for sure. I'm interested why you did the two different editions, one at 20 minutes and then one at 15. Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Yeah. One at 20 and one at 15. I'm not sure what you're trying to get there, but who knows?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. So, the traditional part of my mind when it comes to hopping is you've got your bittering edition, your flavor edition, and then your aroma edition. And aroma editions are those that come at 15 minutes or less. I went with Magnum at 20 because I wanted to get that IBU out of it to compensate for not doing a 60 or 90 minute boil. So I went with the highest alpha variety that I have on hand, or I had on hand, and that was Magnum. So I got my IBU from that, and then I added the middle fruit 5 minutes later, just as kind of that's just what you do, or what I do when I'm making beer. I didn't want the aromatics from the middle fruit to be so strong that it was noticeable. So that's why I didn't add it, at 5 minutes left. I went right at 15. It was just, I don't know. I throw these recipes together. I look at them. That sounds pretty good. And so that's kind of what I did with this one.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, you were talking earlier about adding a little bit of that spicy character to the Belgian Dubbel. That makes sense. I generally don't add any sort of flavor or aroma hops. I'm usually just right at that 60-minute boil. Like you said, using a Magnum or a huge charge of a Saaz or Tettnang or something like that. Just bitterness is really all I'm usually looking for. But.
Sure. And you think about, traditionally if Belgian Dubbel's being made with something like a Saaz, that's a roughly on average about 4% alpha variety. You're adding a heap of that stuff at the beginning of the boil. There is going to be some flavor and aroma carryover. I don't care what anybody says. You're not just getting, bitterness from that just because we call it a bittering addition. You are still going to get some of those hop characteristics that carry through in that beer. And so I was trying to match that a little bit with just a smaller dose of the middle fruit at 15 minutes. And that was probably behind my thinking on that. So when the boil was complete, I chilled the wort to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21°C with my immersion chiller because it was June in Fresno, and that was about as cold as I could get my wort at the time. Again, this is a Belgian beer, which are known, or a lot of people view these styles as being able to ferment a little bit warmer than your standard clean American ale. So I wasn't too concerned about that. A refractometer reading at the time showed that the wort was at a respectable 1065 OG, which I thought was pretty decent for a double that was mashed for just 25 minutes and boiled for 20 minutes. And ultimately that resulted in a 60% brew house efficiency, which I think is pretty decent. I don't know, for such a quick brew day, I'm not too bummed out about that.
I'd say 60% is perfect for a 25 minute mash. I mean, I've certainly, when my mill has been messed up, I've certainly gotten 60 or 65% efficiency on accident before. Whenever I've done a beer. So yeah, totally fine.
And my thinking when people are, oh man, that's so bad, you're wasting. I honestly probably use less than a pound and more malt than I might if I was doing a full 60-minute mash and a 60-minute boil. That does not bother me. I mean, that is pennies on the dollar. So 60% was what I planned for, and I just so happened to hit it. So that was kind of satisfying for me. Next thing I did was I racked that 70-degree Fahrenheit 21°C wort to a brew bucket, which I had sanitized. I'm not too stupid with this short and shoddy thing not to mind my sanitation processes. And then I direct pitch a single pouch of Imperial yeast B45 gnome yeast. Now, I forget exactly where that one is said to be sourced from, but I've used this yeast multiple times in the past for various projects. And I'll tell you, it is a workhorse, boy. It really does ferment that. It gets to work quick and then it attenuates really, really quite quickly. Have you used gnome yet?
Yeah, I have. Actually, on the most recent Dubbel that I did this year, I used gnome, which is a really good yeast. I really like it. Like I said, I still like triple double better for a double, but gnome is really good. It's got a really strong phenol character to it. That's got that really nice clove and pepper character, which I think is good. It's a really nice, tasty, and flavorful yeast. But again, I like the triple double just a little bit more because it's a little bit more nuanced, a little more refined in those phenols characters. But if you're looking for something with that phenol, you want to accentuate that clove and pepper character, gnome is a perfect yeast for that.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I would have loved to have used something like triple double, but when I'm designing these short and shoddy batches, every time I do it, I usually come up with the idea based on the yeast that's in my fridge. So I can figure out pretty much everything else because I've got just a a heap of hops in my freezer. I've got a bunch of grains on hand. It's usually the yeast that determines what short and shoddy beer I'm going to make next. And well, I had this gnome, and I was just really in the mood for a nice, characterful double, and that's why I went with it. I was talking with somebody. I wish I knew who it was, because I feel like it might have been Casey from Imperial Yeast, who was saying that what they really enjoy about gnome is that it, in addition to the phenolic, that almost white pepper or that spicy. I wouldn't say that I get cloves so much as I do a more peppery thing with a hint of that clove character. But in addition to that, the ester that it gives off, rather than being just your kind of generic fruity ester, is kind of a perry, almost apple pear type of ester that to me sounded like it would go well with that richer sugary flavor that you get from that you get in a double, from the candy syrup that's used.
I should clarify also what I was saying about the clove. The clove is not overpowering in gnome. I was comparing it to those saison yeast strains, which are much more peppery than gnome is. Which gnome is peppery, and that's certainly what I get from it. And I think maybe that's the character why I like the triple double better, because I don't get that peppery character from it.
To me, it sounded like it would work, and that's why I went with it. Plus, it was all the Belgian yeast I had on hand. So the filled fermenter was then placed in my fermentation chamber, which during the summer, I basically just keep it controlled to room temp, which is 68F or 20C. And so that's where I was going to ferment it. I had no interest in trying to push a stronger ester profile by fermenting it any warmer than that. So I just left it in the kind of the room temp fermentation chamber. And I did attach my CO2 capture device just because I feel like it's a shoddier process that sounds really complex, but to use naturally produced carbon dioxide to purge the keg that the beer will eventually go into. Fermentation activity, no joke, was noticed just 7 hours later. I mean, you had a fairly decent OG with a fairly fresh pouch of Belgian yeast that's known to ferment well. So 7 hours, I was seeing some pretty hearty bubble in it out of the setup that I have, my CO2 capture setup. And then it proceeded actively ferment for the following few days. After 9 days, there were no signs of activity left, so I took a hydrometer measurement, and it showed that the beer had finished at a nice and low 1008 FG, which I believe is the lower range of what the BJCP gives. I was so pleased to see that. That resulted in a beer with 7.6% ABV. Pretty ideal, in my opinion, for a Belgian double.
Yeah, that's exactly where I would want to be with the Belgian double. That 1008 FG is perfect. And at least from the final gravity pick, it's got a really nice, pleasant color to it.
Yeah, I was at this point, I'm looking at the final gravity picture going, okay, looks like a Belgian double to me. Perhaps a bit lighter than what other doubles I've had are. But, we'll talk about that in a minute. So at this point, though, I disconnected the fermentation vessel from the now purged keg, and then I attached external CO2 to the fermenter just to reduce suck back of oxygen while cold crashing. Again, short and shoddy is my attempt to make the best beer I can while cutting corners that don't result in a beer being bad. I know a lot of people think that I'm trying to make bad beer. That's not the case. I then cold crashed the beer to 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. And then the next day, so after I think it was about 18 hours, I pressure transferred that beer to a naturally purged keg, which was burst carbonated overnight in my keezer before I reduced the gas to serving pressure and let it sit for a week or so of conditioning, cold conditioning on that lower PSI until the beer was ready to serve. And at that point, I felt like the carbonation was spot on, nice and sparkly. I put it on my line that has about 15 foot of beer tubing, nice, and I think I served it at 14 or 15 PSI, and it worked out really well. Got a nice head on it. I would say that the color was like we mentioned earlier, it looked really pretty. It was a fair bit lighter than what you'll see most Belgian double, I think commercially, what their color is. You get more of a deep auburn, reddish, blood red almost color out of a lot of the commercial Belgian double out there. But in this one, it was more of a light, almost Irish red looking color. It decently clear. I thought it was fairly pretty, just a fair bit lighter than you might expect.
Yeah, it looks a little bit lighter than what I would normally expect from a double. And I don't know. I wonder, why it was that was so much lighter. You used a nice amount of Special B, which you would have thought would have added some nice darker color to it. Maybe a little bit more candy sugar would have also added the color up. And actually, that reminds me real quick. I need to clarify something before I get a bunch of feedback. I said earlier that I used D120 candy syrup. That was an old recipe that I've trashed. I was looking at the wrong recipe. I also use that D45, which is the Belgian candy syrup, but I use about almost 2 pounds of it. I use like 18 ounces of it. So I use a lot of it. I really like that flavor and I really like that character to it. So
there are certainly people out there who use the D120 or darker candy syrups to get that color, and I do feel like that's one of the areas that if I had drunkenly purchased a darker candy syrup, I would have used that in its place, and I do think that the color would have been more in line with what you expect. But I was happy with how this turned out, and so far, all I'm doing is it's based on visual inspection of the beer in the glass. I'm thinking this is going to be pretty good, so I went and I smelled it and I gave it a drink. This was prior to me serving it to tasters, which was obviously prior to this crazy COVID crap we're going through. And I thought the beer was quite good, malty yet dry with noticeable yet not distracting Belgian fermentation character, which is exactly what I want. It slightly favored the phenolics over the esters, which now that you mentioned your experience with Gnome as being a bit more phenolic makes sense to me. There was that peppery, slight undercurrent of clove that I got in this beer. But to me, it felt like it really held up well to all of the other characteristics in the beer. I did get a very pleasant dark fruit flavor, but I also got some nice earthy notes as well. And I don't know, I'm trying to parse this out in my mind going, what am I perceiving here? And it just seemed to me that earthy thing is something, there's a slight earthy note that I get when I'm using middle fruit. And so I wondered if maybe that 15-minute middle fruit addition might have contributed a little bit of that. Regardless, I thought the beer was better than I expected it to be in the first place, so I was fairly pleased with it.
Yeah, all those flavor descriptors sound great. I mean, even that earthy character too. I might describe that depending. Obviously, I didn't taste the beer. Maybe that was clove coming through as well, or just the mix of everything. That was coming through. All those flavor descriptors sound really nice. I mean, that's exactly what I'm looking for in a Dubbel. So if you hit that doing short and shoddy methods, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Hey. Well, of course, I wasn't gonna be the only one to evaluate this though. Because it wasn't COVID. So I went and I served it to 23 unsuspecting tasters. Now, just a note, this was done prior to us changing the survey where we started telling tasters the style before they evaluate it. I'm so glad we made that change because I feel like when you have something to kind of anchor your thinking to or your perception to, then it allows you to evaluate things in a bit different or more of a focused way. Regardless, this was one of the short and shoddy surveys that did not include that. So the first question, which I absolutely loathe, was what style of beer do you think this is? Imagine how difficult this is. So participants were asked to identify the style, and the responses were expectedly all over the place, though three out of the 23 people did correctly choose Belgian Dubbel, while another 3 chose fruit and spice beer, which I feel like is fairly close. Anyways, I'm not going to go over all of the other millions of styles that people selected, but 6 people got something that was within range, and I feel like that's pretty decent. All right, so then the next question had to do with rating the beer in terms of how malty, hoppy, and dry the beer is. Tasters seem to perceive the strongest characteristics as being the beer's maltiness, which yielded an average rating of about 2.8 out of 5. Dryness came in second, and then hoppy was a distant third. To me, that's right about what you'd expect for a Belgian Dubbel. You want that malt character to kind of lead, but this doesn't talk about fermentation character necessarily. We'll get to that later. But then the dryness to be noticeable as well. And this is not a hoppy style.
Yeah, for sure. I would want the malty and dry. I would want both those to be pretty equal, or pretty similar. If I were looking at that, because I'd want some people. Because certainly, I think it also just sort of depends on the swallow. I would certainly describe some doubles that I've had as malty, some as dry, or maybe even the same double. I might describe it as malty on one drink and then dry on the next.
Sure, sure.
So yeah, that's again right where I want it to be in a double.
Yeah. So then the next question has people rate different characteristics in terms of hop, malt, and yeast character. So in terms of hop character, the most prominent hop characteristic was spicy. 8 out of 23 people thought that the spiciness of the hop character came through. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that what they were perceiving as spicy was from the hops because of the gnome yeast. And we'll get to that in a sec because I think the ratings on that's pretty interesting. Another 7 did rate the most prominent hop characteristic as being earthy. So right there, you got 15 out of 23 people saying either spicy or earthy. This is kind of going along with my perception. 3 people rated fruity, and then 2 people said dank and caddy, and then 1 person each rated pine, resinous, melon, and onion. Garlic. I don't know where they got the dank, caddy, or the onion garlic, but hey, everybody's palate's a little bit different. But again, winning out the hop character vote on that is spicy and earthy. And then we move on to malt character. This one makes sense to me. 7 out of 23 of the participants rated caramel sweet as the most prominent malt characteristic. That makes sense to me. Even though the beer was perceptibly dry, there is this perception of sweetness that you get from a good double that I don't think gets in the way.
Yeah, it's that burnt sugar raisin flavor. It's caramel. It's that really nice sweetness. And again, I'm talking about this, and I've said a bunch of times, it's dry, right? Doubles are dry beers, but yeah, you do get this nice sweetness to them, and that's exactly where I'd want the malt characteristics. I don't know what the options were. I would have, of course, liked to have seen something like dark fruit as a malt character, and maybe see some people get that, but. Who knows? I mean, that's also a really nuanced deal. But caramel and sweet being the number one, that's, again, it looks like we're so far right in the lanes of where we need to be on a double.
Yeah, and again, that's 7 out of 23. Then you consider the fact that 5 people each rated cracker bread crust, toasty, and nutty. So another 15 tasters rated those 3 as being the strongest malt character. Again, I feel like we're on track here. 1 person felt that roast malt character was the most prominent. I don't know who's doing that, but hey, again, a subjective preference or subjective palates there. But again, cracker bread crust, toasty, and nutty almost matching the perception that some had of the beer having a caramely sweet malt character. So I think, again, we're on track. Now, in terms of yeast character, fermentation characteristics, 8 out of 23 of the participants felt that phenolic was the fermentation character, while another 6 said that it was esters. Again, we're hitting the Belgian, theme fairly well here.
Yeah, esters and phenols. That's the one I want to have. That's where I want it to be. I think it's interesting here too. There were 5 tasters that said it was clean, which I find really surprising, especially with a Belgian yeast, because and my experience with Gnome, because Gnome definitely has those phenolics. It's definitely got sort of an estery profile to it too. But maybe clean, maybe also what they're sort of talking about here is just that it finishes really dry.
Yeah.
And, it didn't have any higher alcohol character or any off flavors or anything like that. But
right. And that's, there's a part of those 5 people who rated it as clean that made me feel kind of proud because I like a cleaner Belgian beer. But you have to consider they still didn't know what the style of beer was yet. So they're shooting from the hip in their evaluations of this beer, which makes to me the fact that they rated phenolic and esters as being the 2 most prominent yeast characteristics. It says a lot to me that this turned out well. It's a Belgian beer. And then also keep in mind, 3 people thought sulfur fermentation character was number 1, and 1 person rated wild. I sort of get the wild one because, Belgian yeast kind of have that interesting, unique fermentation characteristic anyways. But in terms of off flavors, so the participants are asked, do you pick up any off flavors? 1 person said they got a little bit of DMS. Another person said they got some acetaldehyde. And then 1 person said they got a musty off flavor. I think the DMS doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think a lot of people pick that up when they taste Pilsner malt character. That's my personal opinion. The acetaldehyde, again, it could be somebody who is maybe just perceiving a little bit of that apple pear ester, which would make sense. Musty makes so much sense to me. If you mix Belgian character with earthy hops, I think you can. I can see how somebody might perceive that, not knowing what style of beer it is, particularly, could perceive that as kind of a musty character.
I'm right there with you as well, especially that clove character. Clove with any kind of earthy could really come across as musty, But yeah, I think that could also just be somebody that didn't have the words to describe, the phenol, or maybe didn't understand that it was the phenols or something that they were doing. The acetaldehyde and the DMS, I like you. I'm a little bit less persuaded that was the phenols. The acetaldehyde could just be an ester, and then the DMS really surprises me too. Although you and I both have strong opinions about perception of DMS in beer.
Yeah.
But who knows? I mean, maybe this person did get, like you said, some of that Pils malt character, or some of that candy sugar, or any of that stuff adding to their perception of corny DMS flavors.
Sure, yeah. All right, so in terms of preference, again, we asked the tasters on a scale of 0 to 5, with 5 being you love this beer and 0 meaning you hate it. How much do you like it, basically? Not knowing what the beer was at this point in time, 0 out of 23 of the tasters gave it a 5 out of 5. Womp, womp. That's okay with me.
Womp, womp.
You don't expect people to think it's the best beer they've ever had, so that's fine with me. And the fact that 8 out of 23 of the tasters gave it a 4 out of 5, that felt pretty good. Okay, I feel like I nailed it, or at least that the beer was good enough to drink. It's not like people were puking when they were tasting it. And then another 9 out of 23, so 17 altogether gave it a 3 or a 4 out of 5. That's pretty good. 17 out of 23. I feel like I'm on the right track here. 3 people rated it as a 2 out of 5. 1 person gave it a 1 out of 5. And 2 people really did not like this beer and gave it a 0 out of 5. That's fine with me. I don't know if that says anything about the beer in particular, except for that these people who I was serving it to, it kind of speaks to their preferences.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, I think some people certainly don't like Belgian style beers because of those phenol and estery characters in the yeast. So you might have that could certainly have influenced this.
Yeah. So at this point on this old survey is when we tell people what the beer is. We let them know that it was intended to be a Belgian double. We don't say anything about how it was brewed, so they still have no clue that it was a short and shoddy batch. I'm not sure everybody would understand what exactly that meant anyways at this time, because this was a relatively new series. 1 out of 23 people said that it was a 5 out of 5, meaning that they thought it was a perfect representation of the style. I don't know who put that. I wouldn't have put that, but I do felt like it was pretty close. I agreed with probably the other 6 people who gave it a 4 out of 5. I'd say it was pretty close. Maybe a little bit darker would have pushed me a little higher in my rating of how well it represented the style, but compared to other doubles that I had, I do feel like it hit the mark far more so than some other short and shoddy batches that I've made before. And then 11 people gave it a 3 out of 5. I mean, that's kind of your average rating. Like, yeah, it was pretty close. Probably I would be thinking on this one, like, yeah, it's an Americanized version of a Belgian double.
I think you also mentioned earlier too, that spicy character on the hops, which I think that might have pushed it a little bit away from a traditional double. For some people, they might have been tasting that and thinking it was a little too hoppy, or that maybe that spicy mixed with the earthy from the middle fruit or something.
Yeah.
Maybe that pushed it just a little bit out of the style too. Again, I don't think either of those things are inappropriate necessarily. No. I think those are probably in a lot of the doubles that I've had. Actually, one of the common descriptors that I've seen about doubles is tobacco sometimes as well. There's like a really rich tobacco. I'm not talking about like a smoke flavor, but that pipe tobacco flavor.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I did not get that in this beer at all. This one was very much now I don't want to say caramel, but that really, what you expect from a candy syrup, and then that with the special B and the malt and the gnome. That's really what I got from it. Another 4 people gave it a 2 out of 5 in terms of how well it represents the style. 1 person gave it a 1 out of 5, and nobody rated it a 0 out of 5. So on that front, I mean, we're looking decent. That is a tough question to ask people because you don't know how many people have ever had a double. We do give the BJCP description so they have something to anchor their rating to. But people are just kind of, again, going with what they think a double is, and then comparing this beer to that. So thoughts overall, I felt like this was a very successful short and shoddy batch. Again, more so than other ones I've made in the past. And this was one of those beers that I would absolutely, and again, this coming from a dude who doesn't make that much Belgian beer, I would brew this one again exactly how it was brewed and drink it all day. However, I would, in future batches, I think because I want to get closer to that richer double character, I would go with a slightly darker candy syrup, and I'd probably drop the honey malt, only because I would want the characteristics, that raisin characteristic from the Special B to come through a little bit more strong. I wouldn't increase the Special B at all, but I would probably stick with using a little bit of Special B. I really loved the way that Munich malt, what I think the Munich malt contributed in that background warm graham cracker character.
Yeah, instead of that honey malt, I might, like I said, mix in some kind of Cara body malt, like Cara Munich or Cara foam or something like that. Maybe instead, maybe instead. But the other thing I would do, I think, is maybe not have that second middle for addition, or at least at 15 minutes. Maybe you got some aromatics from that were mixing with the phenolic of Gnome. But otherwise, I mean, this looks like it was a straight down the lane shot of Belgian Dubbel. I mean, all of the characteristics that people were coming up with are certainly representative of doubles. So, it doesn't seem to me like there was anything wrong with this beer. And if you liked it and enjoyed it, man, this is, I love seeing these short and shotties, especially of traditional styles with nuance like Belgian Dubbel. And then you still get a beer using shoddy methods that straight down the lanes are representative of the style. I think is just fantastic. Yeah.
And just to kind of finish up on this one, I wasn't the only one who enjoyed it. Both Jersey and Tim were big fans of it as well. And most of the friends that came over when I had this on tap were quite pleased with how it turned out. So I was happy with the way it turned out as well. And again, I'd brew it up again. If you're looking to make a quick turnaround double, consider doing something like this. All right, just a couple of reader comments because I know we've gone a bit past our normal length on this episode. First one comes from Scott Kromick. He says, do you think the beer would have benefited from additional conditioning time at fermentation temperature? So I think what Scott's asking is if I would have left the primary at firm temp before cold crashing so quickly. I don't know, man. That's one of those things when back in the day, as I was right after I'd gone from extract to all grain brewing, you'd read a lot of you keep it in the primary for 3 weeks and that way the yeast cleans up and yada, yada. I just never noticed much benefit from doing that. And so kind of as a matter of course, I don't do it, but perhaps it would have benefited from it. Again, I thought the beer turned out well. So I don't know.
I'm kind of in the same camp as you now. Once it's done fermenting, meaning like once you've reached that final gravity, yes, there are things that the yeast can clean up afterwards, but you're pretty much done. And most of that stuff will happen relatively quickly, or at least that's what we're learning these days, and certainly my experience. So I'm not sure that adding additional conditioning time at fermentation temperature may have done something. We could get into a whole different discussion about, bottling and re-fermenting in the bottle and all that stuff. I think we've even done some experiments on that.
Yeah.
That may have certainly changed, it could have certainly changed things. I won't say that it would have, but it could have changed things. I'm not sure that it would have benefited from any longer conditioning time at fermentation temperature.
Yeah, me either. Final comment comes from Joshua A. DeCam, who says, any chance you want to leave an inkling for what you use and how much for your haphazardly tossing minerals into the water approach? I'd like to use the same short and shoddy approach myself. Well, if I had to guess, Joshua, I'd say that the water was close to about 80-50 sulfate to chloride. I've said this before. I only use gypsum and chloride or calcium chloride to adjust my mineral profile these days. I'm not worried too much about mash pH. I don't use acids anymore. And these are things that I picked up from my experience with certain experiments. So, again, 80-50-ish sulfate to chloride, but do what works for you. If you like a rounder, warmer malt character, then make your water favor chloride. That's what you'll get from it. So, what would you do with your water?
I'm probably measuring it or using whatever Beersmith and Martin Brewingard's spreadsheet would suggest based on my water profile, because I brew with tap water. But if I could say like a very general rule of thumb, or a very, very very rough, maybe short and shoddy, is like a teaspoon of gypsum and like 3/4 of a teaspoon of calcium, or 3/4 of a teaspoon of calcium chloride. Because at least where I get them, the calcium chloride's in those little balls, which takes up a lot of space, but that adds just enough. That's kind of where I'm at, just on like rough, if I'm just trying to get a balanced, neutral water profile.
Yeah.
Now I do, that's heavily influenced by the fact that I use acids. So if you're trying to use gypsum or something to reduce your pH, that's probably not going to work. But again, you're asking for short and shoddy, and that's kind of where I would say I'm at for short and shoddy on those things.
Yeah, very well. Well, Cade, I do think that covers pretty much everything about Belgian Dubbel. Again, I know we went a little bit longer in this episode than we usually do. I'm finding that to be the case with most of these short and shoddy episodes. It's easy for us to go off the beaten path when talking about certain styles. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish things up?
No, I think we covered it all. Sounds good. Go drink a double or a double, however you want to pronounce it.
I was just going to say it's double, not double, but you call it what you want. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Belgian Dubbel. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown.